The air on Taros, a forge moonlit in the beleaguered Dianoi Sept, was a cacophony of scent and sound. The metallic tang of scorched plasteel mingled with the greasy, fungal stench of orcs and the sharp ozone snap of tow pulse weaponry. For Commander Oshasera, shielded within the command interface of her XD-22 battlesuit, the war was a sterile flow of holographic data runes. Red icons, crude and jagged for the greenskin hordes, swarmed against the precise interlocking blue symbols of her fire-cast hunter cadres. For 3 solar cycles this battle had raged, a war of attrition to prevent the orc Wah of Gul'Grotz from shattering the Septi's primary forge world. The linchpin of her strategy, the anchor of her entire western flank, was not tow steel or doctrine. It was Kroot flesh and ferocity. Thousands of them, a vast convocation of kindreds led by the venerable Shaper Grek, held the line in the jagged industrial canyons, their savagery a perfect counter to the orcs' brute force. They were auxiliaries, yes, but on worlds like Taros, they were the very foundation of the greater good's victory. Something was wrong. The first sign was a subtle shift in the data flow. The blue icons representing the Kroot kindreds, normally a fluid reactive swarm, engulfing and isolating orc mobs, began to stutter. Their movements grew erratic, their kill counts per tactical interval plummeting. Oshasera zoomed the tactical display, her brow furrowing within her helmet. She saw Kroot warriors mid-charge slowing to a halt. Krootoks, who should have been laying down suppressing fire with their dorsal cannons, were instead lifting their great heads, sniffing the polluted air as if tasting a new, unidentifiable savor. Her private comms channel crackled. "Commander," came the clipped, anxious voice of Chassel Kayan, her second. "We are observing anomalous behavior among the Kroot contingents. They are disengaging. I repeat, they are disengaging the enemy." Disengaging was not a word in the Kroot martial lexicon. They fought until the enemy was broken or they were dead. There was no other way. Oshasera switched to the direct visual feed from a reconnaissance drone hovering high above the canyons. The sight was more disturbing than any data stream could convey. The battle still raged, a maelstrom of explosions and guttural war cries, but in the heart of it, a stillness was spreading. A Kroot warrior, its hide scarred and its rifle still hot, stood utterly motionless, its beaked head tilted towards the sky, ignoring the orc knob bearing down on it with a roaring chain choppa. The knob, confused for a moment by the lack of resistance, brought its weapon down in a shower of gore. The Kroot's comrades did not react. They did not avenge their fallen kin. They simply stood, their black, depthless eyes fixed on Poeb, point in the void beyond the moon's thin atmosphere. One by one, then in dozens, then in hundreds, they turned. Their backs on the orc horde, they began to walk, a slow, deliberate exodus, away from the battle lines. Their shapers moved among them, not rallying them to fight, but guiding their retreat, their long staffs tapping out a silent, rhythmic beat. "Shaper Grek," Oshasera's voice was cold steel, broadcast directly into the aged Kroot's vox bead. "Your kindreds are breaking formation. Explain this immediately. Uphold your hold your oath to the greater good." For a long moment, there was only static. Then a voice, ancient and dry as rustling leaves, replied. It was not insubordinate. It was simply whooped, distant. "The oath is dust, Tau. A new wind blows. A greater hunt calls." The channel went dead. Oshasera watched in disbelief as the entire western flank of her army dissolved. The Kroot were not fleeing in a rout. They were withdrawing with a discipline she had never witnessed, forming silent, orderly columns and marching towards their designated extraction zones, where their hulking, primitive transport ships squatted amidst the grime. They left behind them a gaping hole in the tow lines, a vulnerability the orcs were already beginning to exploit with joyous, bellowing laughter. This was not an isolated incident. Across the galaxy, the phenomenon was repeating itself. On the agri-world of Shagal, Kroot mercenaries defending tow Earth-cast surveyors from piratical Drukhari simply lowered their rifles and melted into the jungles. In the Void War for the Kelshan Sept, the crews of Kroot war spheres abandoned their Tau Naval liaisons, turning their colossal spherical vessels towards the galactic rim without a word of explanation. It was a coordinated, species-wide schism, enacted with terrifying precision. The source of it, the nexus of the Great Betrayal, was a name that only the highest echelons of the Tow Command and the most ancient of Kroot shapers knew, Angkor Prak, a master shaper of Pik, a recluse and a visionary, whose pronouncements were regarded as prophecies. He had been silent for decades, a forgotten relic of a bygone age. But now his voice was echoing, not through comms or astropathic relays, but through the very genetic marrow of his species. The Kroot on Taros felt it as a low, pervasive hum in their quills, a scent of promise on a wind that did not blow. It spoke of stagnation, of a slow, creeping death not by bolt gun or blade, but by genetic complacency. For generations they had eaten the flesh of the galaxy's warring races, yet they remained fundamentally unchanged. The orcs made them momentarily stronger, the humans momentarily more cunning, but the core of their being was locked in a genetic cul-de-sac. They were trapped, a species whose greatest strength, their ability to evolve, had failed them. Angkor Prak's call was a message of salvation through a final, desperate heresy. It spoke of a feast that would change them forever. It spoke of a prey so potent, so saturated with the raw essence of adaptation, that its consumption would either shatter their genetic chains or extinguish them utterly. The call had a name, a direction, a target. Hive Fleet Echidna, a splinter of the Great Devourer, a serpentine tendril of biohorrors that was methodically consuming the forgotten stars of the Halar Tract. To hunt it, to consume it, would be the ultimate ritual. It would be the great hunt, and in its name, all other oaths were rendered meaningless. As the Kroot boarded their ships on Taros, leaving Oshacera's armies to be butchered, they did not look back. Their eyes, once filled with the simple ferocity of the hunt, now held a new and terrible light, the cold, calculating hunger of a species gambling its very soul for the promise of ascension. The tranquil halls of the ethereal council on Tone, usually a sanctuary of serene contemplation and absolute authority, had become the heart of a raging storm. Holographic displays, once showing orderly projections of economic growth and successful pacification campaigns, now flickered with 1,000 points of crisis. Red alert runes blinked with frantic urgency, each one a testament to a collapsing front, a routed army, a dying world. Anva, the undisputed master of the greater good, stood motionless on the central dais, his ancient face an unreadable mask of calm, but the slight, continuous twitch of a finger on his honor blade betrayed the turmoil within. Before him, an assembly of the Empire's highest commanders, their images projected from light years away, spoke over one another in a cacophony of disbelief and rage. "The entire Falshia blockade is compromised," bellowed a grizzled Shasso, his faceplate retracted to reveal a snarl. The Kroot war sphere Gnarlmaw and its support vessels simply turned and vanished. The orcs punched through the gap like a Kroot hound through a gutsack. "We've lost 3 Protector-class cruisers and the starport at VN." From another display, a Watercast ambassador, her voice trembling, reported, "We have attempted to open diplomatic channels with every known Shaper Council. We are met with nothing. Complete silence. It is as if the entire species has ceased to exist on any comm frequency." A third projection, an Earthcast engineer of high standing, added his grim assessment. "Logistics are in chaos. The Kroot were integral to our supply chains in the eastern fringe. They served as guides, laborers, and guards. We have supply convoys that have been stranded for days, their Kroot escorts having abandoned them in hostile territory. The losses in material alone will set back the Fifth Sphere expansion by decades." The reports were all the same, a litany of abandonment from every corner of the Toe Empire. From the crystalline cities of Sasea to the contested nebulae near the Damocles Gulf, the story repeated with nightmarish consistency. On the mud-soaked death world of Klaxus Prime, the 4th Guivesa Regiment, human auxiliaries who had fought alongside the Kroot for 3 generations found themselves utterly alone. One moment, their flanks were held by the shrieking charges of Kroot carnivore squads, a terrifying but reassuringly familiar sight. The next, there was only the dripping jungle and the chittering of unseen things. The chaos-worshipping tribes they were fighting, sensing the shift in the balance of power, launched a frenzied assault. The Govesa, their lines suddenly and inexplicably overextended, were engulfed. Their last desperate pleas for aid were met with silence, the Kroot having already melted into the fetid wilderness, their strange, loping transports lifting into the sky without a backward glance. The 4th Guivesa died to man their faith in the greater good drowned in blood and mud. The void itself bled tau plasma. In the asteroid fields of the Charpactan system, a Tel-Korvatra fleet under the command of a brilliant young admiral, Koro Valroth, was engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with a fleet of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Tau strategy was perfect, a textbook application of the Muntka, the killing blow. They had lured the lumbering, stubborn Imperial vessels into a trap, with Kroot war spheres acting as a seemingly primitive but impossibly durable anvil. The plan was for the Tau fleet to encircle the Mechanicus ships and annihilate them with concentrated railgun fire against the anvil of the Kroot. But as the Tau ships executed their flawless maneuver, the anvil vanished. The war spheres, without firing a final shot or offering a single word of warning, simply powered their strange, gravity-defying drives and accelerated away into the void, leaving the Tau fleet horribly exposed. The Mechanicus ships, slow to adapt, but merciless once they understood their advantage, unleashed devastating broadsides. Valroth's flagship, the Vision of Unity, was crippled in the opening volley, its command bridge reduced to vacuum-blasted wreckage. The entire fleet, caught mid-maneuver, was savaged and broken. It was a strategic catastrophe born not from a failure of doctrine, but from a betrayal so profound it defied all Tau logic. Back in the council chamber, Oshasera's own icon blinked, requesting permission to speak. Aunva granted it with a slow nod. Her voice was cold, devoid of the panic that infected the others. It was the voice of the warrior, the pragmatist. The greenskin advance on Tros has been halted. The cost was extreme. I was forced to sacrifice the entire 3rd Hunter cadre to plug the gap left by the Kroot. The western flank is gone. My forces are at 40% strength. She paused, letting the brutal facts sink in. I have analyzed the departure vectors of the Kroot vessels from this sector. They align with similar reports from Falshia and Kelshan. They are all converging on a single heading, the trailing rim, specifically the largely unexplored Halor tract. Another commander interjected. Scouts in that region have reported increased activity from Hive Fleet Echidna. A terrible, chilling silence fell over the council chamber. The pieces of the puzzle, disparate and chaotic, began to form a coherent and horrifying image. The Watercast ambassador spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. We have been reviewing our anthropological archives on the Kroot. There are mentions in ancient texts from Pech of a great hunt, a species-wide ritual mobilization undertaken only when their genetic path is threatened, a hunt to consume a worthy prey and redirect the course of their evolution. The implications of her words descended like a shroud. This was not a simple mercenary dispute or a political maneuver. It was a biological imperative, a spiritual crusade. The Tau Empire, the greater good, their shared history and oaths of allegiance, all of it had been weighed against this ancient primal drive and had been found wanting. The Kroot had not simply abandoned the Tau, they had discarded them. They were a tool that was no longer useful, a partnership that had ceased to serve the Kroot's ultimate selfish purpose, their own survival and evolution. The betrayal was absolute, a fundamental rejection of the Tau's entire worldview. Aunva finally moved, raising a single hand to quell the rising tide of fear. His voice, when it came, was quiet, yet it cut through the chaos like a laser. Commander Oshasera, the Council is in accord. This act of secession cannot stand. The auxiliaries must be reminded of their place. Your new directive is this: assemble a punitive fleet, pursue the Kroot armada. You will discover the meaning of this great hunt, and you will deliver the Council's judgment upon those who have broken faith. Remind them that the greater good is not a partnership of convenience. It is an inevitability. Oshasera's helmeted face gave a single sharp nod, the order received. But as she severed the connection, a cold truth settled in her heart. The Tau Empire had been built on a lie. It had believed it was enlightening the galaxy, when in fact it had merely been renting the services of a predator far older and far more hungry than it could ever have imagined. The exodus of the Kroot was a sight unseen in the galaxy for 10,000 years. It was not a fleet in the imperial or Tau sense. It was a migration, a nomadic nation taking to the stars. The core of this vast armada was the great war spheres, moon-sized vessels of ancient, unfathomable technology. Their pitted, irregular hulls were not forged from metal plates, but grown from a psychoactive material that shimmered with organic patterns, scarred by millennia of stellar debris and forgotten wars. From countless ports and docking arms across their surfaces, a swarm of smaller, uglier ships orbited like pilot fish around a pod of leviathans. These were the vessels of the mercenary kindreds. Converted orc freighters, belching black smoke into the void, commandeered rogue trader transports, still bearing the faded double-headed eagle of the Imperium, and bizarre Xenos craft of designs that defied sane classification. It was a fleet of scavengers and predators, a chaotic yet single-minded torrent of ships pouring in from every quadrant of the galaxy. They moved with a purpose that unnerved the few observers who witnessed their passage. Astropaths on isolated Imperial listening posts felt their passage not as a wave of warp taint, but as a vast cold silence, a psychic void where there should have been the chatter of a billion living minds. It was as if the Kroot had collectively withdrawn into some deep, primal trance, their thoughts focused solely on the prey. On the bridges of these strange ships there was no panic, no disorder. Kroot carnivores whose lives had been spent in the mud and blood of ground wars now manned weapon consoles and navigation arrays with an unnerving, instinctual competence. They did not speak, communicating through a complex language of subtle quill movements and sharp clicking vocalizations. Their leaders, the Shapers, stood like statues amidst the activity, their gnarled hands gripping their ceremonial staffs, their eyes clouded as they communed with the nascent will of their species, the call of Ankor Proc that resonated in their very DNA. The journey to the trailing rim was a grand and brutal consolidation. The Armada was a magnet, drawing to itself every stray Kroot in its path. A small kindred that had served a Necron lord as trackers for centuries felt the call, and without a word to their silent masters, slaughtered the Canoptek guards at their local spaceport and stole an ancient crescent-shaped vessel joining the river of ships. A famous Kroot mercenary company in the employ of an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, renowned for their loyalty, suddenly turned on their imperial paymasters during a lull in a campaign against genestealer cults. They butchered the Inquisitor and his retinue, consumed their flesh for the journey, and steered their captured strike cruiser towards the growing Armada. Every act of desertion and betrayal across the Toe Empire was but a single tributary feeding this immense, galaxy-spanning river of purpose. Their path was not unchallenged. A patrol of White Scar's strike cruisers investigating the sudden disappearance of an Adeptus Mechanicus explorator fleet moved to intercept the strange fleet near the Gloom Deeps. The Space Marines, paragons of swift void warfare, expected to encounter a disorganized rabble of Xenos pirates. They launched their initial assault with lightning speed, Thunderhawk gunships streaking towards the nearest warsphere. The Kroot response was shockingly coordinated. The warsphere did not return fire with conventional energy weapons. Instead, vast sections of its hull peeled open like the petals of a monstrous flower, revealing banks of what appeared to be organic catapults. With silent, tremendous force, these catapults launched hundreds of smaller, teardrop-shaped pods directly into the path of the attacking Thunderhawks. The pods were living creatures, Krootkin bred and shaped for void combat. They slammed into the Imperial gunships, their hardened carapaces cracking ceramite, their powerful limbs tearing through fuselages. In the cold vacuum, they swarmed over the crippled vessels, ripping them apart with beak and claw. The White Scar's cruisers, faced with this utterly alien form of warfare, were momentarily thrown into disarray. That was all the Kroot needed. The warsphere, moving with an unnatural agility for its size, surged forward, its immense mass simply crushing the lead strike cruiser in a slow-grinding collision of adamantium and bioluminescent flesh. The remaining White Scars, stunned and outmaneuvered, were forced into a humiliating retreat, broadcasting a high-priority warning to the Segmentum Command of a new and unpredictable Xenos threat. The convergence point was a dead zone of space known as the Stygian Nebula, a swirling vortex of cosmic dust and stillborn stars on the edge of the Halor Tract. Here the Armada finally coalesced. It was a sight to humble empires. Hundreds of war spheres formed the heart of the fleet, a constellation of artificial worlds. Around them, 10,000 lesser ships created a defensive screen that stretched for millions of kilometers. It was a culture, a civilization, temporarily made manifest as a single nomadic entity. At the very center of this staggering formation floated the root of ages, the personal war sphere of Ankor Proc himself. It was the oldest and largest of its kind, its surface a living history of the Kroot, covered in the fossilized bones of every worthy prey the species had ever consumed. On its command nexus, a cavernous chamber where the air was thick with the scent of ancient peat and ozone, Ankor Proc stood before a shimmering psychic vortex. He was ancient, his skin like petrified wood, his quills long and silver. He was the focal point of the Great Hunt, and through him, The will of a species was being bent toward a single apocalyptic goal. He could feel them, all of them, from the youngest carnivore to the oldest shaper, their individual hungers and fears subsumed into one great collective desire. He could also feel their target. The psychic spore of Hive Fleet Echidna was no longer a distant whisper. It was a deafening roar in the void, a song of endless, mindless consumption. It was a challenge, and for the first time in millennia, the Kroot, united as one, were ready to answer. The Stygian Nebula was a shroud, its swirling dark matter clouds, perfect for masking the Kroot Armada's final approach. Within this cosmic veil, Anchor-Proc's strategy began to unfold. He had no interest in a direct fleet-on-fleet confrontation. That was the way of the toe, a foolish expenditure of resources against a foe for whom attrition was a meaningless concept. The Great Hunt was not about conquest. It was about consumption. To consume the Hive Fleet, they must first learn its taste, adapt to its poisons, and evolve the means to tear it apart from the inside. The first lesson, the first feast, would target one of Echidna's vanguard organisms, a bioship of the Scythe class, a creature larger than any Imperial battleship, designated by Mechanicus explorators as Biovessel Alpha Niner. Alpha Niner moved through the void like a deep-sea predator, a silent behemoth of chitin and sinew. Its vast armored carapace was a mottled purple and black, pitted with sphincter-like weapon ports and sensory organs that pulsed with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. It was a scout, but a scout on a Tyranid scale, capable of birthing entire swarms to overwhelm a planet's initial defenses. It moved at the head of a smaller tendril of the main fleet, a loose formation of lesser bioships, its consciousness a dull, predatory pulse within the greater symphony of the Hive mind. It was utterly unaware of the silent, cold-blooded ambush that awaited it. Anchor-Proc's plan was one of savage elegance. He had dispatched a dozen of the swiftest Kroot vessels, ships crewed by kindreds from worlds where the gravity was high and the air thin, breeding Kroot of exceptional strength and resilience. These ships did not engage Alpha Niner directly. Instead, they performed a series of daring, high-velocity passes, seeding the void in the bioship's path with thousands of dormant Kroot. These were not warriors in pods, but Kroot shaped for this single purpose. Their hides were thickened and coated in a crystalline substance that made them all but invisible to Tyranid biosensors. Their metabolism slowed to a near-death state to radiate almost no heat. They floated in the silent dark like a minefield of living predators. As Alpha Niner drifted into the carefully prepared kill zone, the trap was sprung. The shapers aboard the Kroot vessels sent a silent genetic signal. The dormant Kroot awoke. Their limbs unfolded, revealing huge, sickle-like talons and webbed appendages for void maneuvering. They were no longer land dwellers. They were abyssal hunters. Propelling themselves with controlled bursts of compressed gas from internal sacs, they swarmed towards the Tyranid behemoth. The bioship's immune system, its swarms of smaller drone organisms that patrolled its hull, reacted instantly. Thousands of gargoyles and shrikes poured from fleshy orifices, meeting the Kroot in the void. What followed was a battle of pure biological horror, a silent ballet of violence played out against the backdrop of the swirling nebula. The Kroot were hideously outmatched in sheer numbers, but they fought with a cunning the Tyranid drones lacked. They did not engage in massed formations. They used the complex topography of the bioship's own hull for cover, darting between chitinous spines and weapon growths. Their talons, honed on 1,000 worlds, tore through leathery wings and fleshy bodies with ease. A gargoyle would swoop in, spitting acid, only for a Kroot to drop from above, sink its talons into the creature's neck, and use its momentum to swing around and launch itself at another target. It was a chaotic three-dimensional melee where every Kroot was an individual hunter, a stark contrast to the mindless, collective assault of the Tyranids. While the smaller organisms were engaged, the main assault force of Kroot warriors made their move. They ignored the swirling dogfight and focused on a single objective: breaching the hull. Using shaped charges stolen from Toe Armory and their own powerful limbs, they began to tear their way through the living armor of Alpha Niner. The bioship shuddered, its internal defenses finally recognizing the severity of the threat. Passageways of muscle and bone convulsed, and swarms of hormigants and termagants, creatures designed for ground warfare, were vomited onto the hull's surface. They were clumsy and awkward in the zero-gravity environment, but their sheer numbers and ferocity were immense. The battle on the hull became a meat grinder. Kroot warriors, their rifles adapted to fire shard-like projectiles that were particularly effective against Tyranid carapace, formed firing lines around the breaches, holding back the tide of bodies while their brethren carved deeper. The true feast began inside. Once through the outer layers, the Kroot found themselves in a hellish living labyrinth. The corridors were pulsating arteries, the air thick with amniotic fluid and the stench of alien digestion. Here that the Kroot's primary nature asserted itself. They were not just soldiers, they were consumers. Every Tyranid warrior they killed was immediately and ritualistically devoured. Shapers directed the process, ensuring the most valuable genetic material, adrenal glands, sensory nodes, chitin-secreting organs, was prioritized. With every mouthful of alien flesh, the Kroot were changing. Their skin toughened, taking on the mottled purple hue of the Hive Fleet. The acid-spitting glands of the gargoyles began to develop in their throats. Their talons hardened, mimicking the bioswords of the Tyranid warrior forms. It was a horrifyingly rapid battlefield evolution. The climax of the assault came when the lead shaper, a gnarled Kroot named Catha, reached one of the bioship's primary nerve clusters, a pulsating grapefruit-sized ganglion deep within its body. He and his honor guard fought through waves of ravenous bioforms to reach it. Ignoring the flashing synapses and the psychic scream of the wounded creature, Catha plunged his beak into the organ and began to feed. The knowledge that flooded his mind was overwhelming, a torrent of pure predatory instinct, the cold alien perspective of the hive mind. He saw through the eyes of the fleet, felt its singular galaxy-consuming hunger. The shock killed him, his body spasming as his nervous system was burned out. But the information was past, a genetic memory now imprinted on his kindred. They now knew how the Tyranids fought, how they communicated, how they thought. The price for this knowledge was Catha's life and sanity, a worthy trade. With its primary neural functions compromised, Alpha Niner began to die. It thrashed in the void, its death throes causing catastrophic internal ruptures. The Kroot, their initial objective achieved, began to withdraw, carrying chunks of valuable biomass with them. They left behind a crippled, dying Leviathan, its hull swarming with its own confused and directionless children. The first feast was over. It was a victory, but a brutal one. Thousands of Kroot had died, but those who survived were stronger, faster, and more resilient. They carried within their flesh the seeds of the enemy's destruction. As they regrouped with the main armada, their very appearance had shifted. They were Kroot, but not as they had been. They were something new, something sharper, their eyes glowing with a faint purple light, their minds now armed with the terrible secrets of their prey. The great hunt had truly begun. The knowledge gained from the feast on Bio-Vessel Alpha Niner spread through the Kroot armada like a virus of revelation. It was not shared through spoken words or data scrolls, but through ritual consumption. Shapers who had partaken of the nerve ganglion of the slain bioship were in turn consumed by other shapers, a chain of cannibalistic inheritance that disseminated the fragmented Tyranid consciousness throughout the fleet's command structure. At the apex of this pyramid of flesh and memory sat Angkor Prak. He alone had the psychic fortitude and genetic purity to absorb the unfiltered torrent of the hive mind's perspective without being utterly consumed by it. On the altar-like command dais of the root of ages, he partook of the heart of the shaper Catha, and in doing so, plunged his own mind into a terrifying alien ocean. For a period of 3 full rotations, Angkor Prak was catatonic, his body rigid, his eyes wide and staring into depths no other Kroot could fathom. He saw the galaxy not as a collection of stars and worlds, but as a vast dark pasture, a larder of untapped biomass waiting to be harvested. He felt the cold, dispassionate hunger that drove the Tyranids, a force of nature as implacable as gravity itself. But within that monolithic will, he also sensed the nuances of Hive Fleet Echidna. It was a splinter, but a highly specialized one. It learned. It adapted with a terrifying speed, and at the heart of its command structure, its most potent evolutionary weapon, was a creature of singular purpose and power, a Norn emissary. This being was not merely a synapse creature. It was a living vector of the hive mind's will, a hyper-intelligent hunter-killer that embodied the fleet's capacity to learn and overcome its prey. Angkor Prak understood a chilling truth. As long as the Norn emissary lived, Echidna would continue to evolve countermeasures faster than the Kroot could adapt. To win the great hunt, they could not simply consume the body of the fleet, they had to devour its mind. A legend was about to be forged in blood and biomass. Angkor Prak emerged from his trance, a figure transformed. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a layered chorus, his own ancient tones overlaid with the faint, chittering whispers of the hive mind. He issued a single, audacious command that sent ripples of awe and fear throughout the armada. They would not target another scout vessel or a lumbering bioship. They would hunt the hunter. They would find the Norn emissary, and Angkor Prak himself would lead the assault to consume it. It was a declaration of unimaginable arrogance, an act akin to a single wolf declaring its intention to hunt and eat the alpha of a rival pack 10 times its size. Locating the Norn emissary was the first challenge. It was a phantom, its psychic presence deliberately shielded, moving within the densest swarms of the Hive Fleet, but the knowledge Proc had consumed gave him the key. The emissary was the nexus of adaptation. Wherever the fleet was spawning new and unexpected biomorphs, wherever its strategies shifted with unnatural prescience, the emissary would be close. Using the captured Tyranid senses, the Kroot shapers began to scour the psychic static of the hive mind, not listening for the loudest noise, but for the subtle creative silences where new horrors were being gestated. They found it lurking in the shadow of a colossal hive ship, a living mountain of flesh that served as the fleet's primary spawning ground. The assault was a masterstroke of Kroot predatory cunning. A diversionary force at a quarter of the entire Kroot armada launched a massive frontal assault on the far side of the Hive Fleet, a chaotic suicidal attack designed to draw the attention of the main Tyranid swarms. While the void boiled with the violence of this feint, Angkor Prak led a small, elite flotilla on a silent, looping trajectory, approaching the Hive ship from its blind spot, a sector where its sensory organisms were weakest. His vessel, the Knarloch's Tooth, was an ancient, heavily modified transport, stripped of all non-essential systems to maximize speed and minimize its energy signature. With him were the 5 most powerful kindreds in the armada, their warriors evolved from the feast on Alpha Niner, their hides now a hardened chameleonic carapace, their senses sharpened to a terrifying degree. They boarded the hive ship in silence, cutting their way through its fleshy membrane with concentrated bursts of energy from adapted tow pulse rifles. Inside, the environment was a biological nightmare, but the Kroot moved with a grim purpose, the partial hive mind consciousness they now shared guiding them through the pulsating corridors, past bubbling digestion pools and writhing larval pits. They were ghosts in the machine, their own biosignatures so tainted with Tyranid genetic material that the ship's baser immune responses were slow to identify them as a threat. They found the Norn emissary in a vast cathedral-like chamber at the hive ship's core. The creature was a terrifying spectacle of focused evolution. It stood over 12 meters tall, its form both skeletal and insectoid, with 4 powerful limbs ending in razor-sharp scythes. Its head was an elongated, armored crest, and from its back, delicate, filament-like antennae twitched, tasting the psychic currents of the battle raging light years away. It was surrounded by a phalanx of Tyranid warriors and zoanthropes, its psychic bodyguards. The moment the Kroot entered the chamber, the Norn emissary turned its head, its blank, intelligent eyes fixing on Angkor Prak. There was no animalistic rage in its gaze, only cold, analytical recognition. It had been expecting them. The battle that followed was not one of armies, but of champions. The Kroot Honor Guard, the finest warriors of their species, engaged the Tyranid bodyguards in a brutal melee. The air crackled with psychic energy from the zoanthropes and the shriek of monomolecular claws on hardened Kroot hides. But the true focus was the duel between the 2 commanders. Angkor Prak, armed only with his staff of office, a gnarled length of wood inlaid with the bones of his ancestors, faced the Norn emissary. It was a battle of instinct versus hyper-intelligence. The emissary moved with a speed that defied its size, its scythes blurring as they carved arcs of death through the air. Proc did not meet its force with force. He flowed around the attacks, his movements fluid and unpredictable, guided by a lifetime of predatory experience and his new partial understanding of his foe. He was not just fighting a monster, he was studying it, learning its rhythms, its weaknesses. The tide turned when the emissary, frustrated by its inability to land a decisive blow, unleashed a powerful psychic blast, a wave of pure hive mind terror designed to shatter the sanity of any lesser creature. But Angkor Prok was ready. He met the wave not with resistance, but with a focused projection of his own, the collective, predatory will of the entire Kroot species, the billion-fold hunger of the Great Hunt. The two psychic forces met, and for a moment, the Norn emissary recoiled, stunned by this alien consciousness that was so much like its own, yet so fiercely individual. In that instant of hesitation, Prok struck. He lunged forward, under the creature's guard, and thrust the butt of his staff into its chest, not with enough force to injure it, but to unbalance it. As the creature staggered back, Prok dropped his staff, leaped onto its torso, and sank his beak deep into the fleshy juncture where its head met its neck, tearing out the primary neural ganglia. The psychic scream of the dying Norn emissary echoed through the minds of every Kroot and Tyranid in the sector. Angkor Prok held the pulsating, complex organ in his hands, and before the stunned eyes of his surviving warriors, consumed it whole. The influx of pure, concentrated strategic and evolutionary knowledge was a supernova in his mind. He did not die, he did not go mad, he absorbed it. His eyes began to glow with a terrifying, cold intelligence. He could now see the entirety of Hive Fleet Echidna laid bare before him, its numbers, its trajectory, its spawning cycles, its hidden weaknesses. He was no longer just a shaper. He was a shaper king, a living nexus of Kroot instinct and Tyranid strategic acumen. A legend had been forged, not through heroism, but through a supreme act of predatory consumption. The Great Hunt now had its master, a mind capable of waging a war of evolution itself. The death of the Norn emissary was an event of apocalyptic significance, a psychic thunderclap that reverberated through the entire structure of Hive Fleet Echidna. For a creature as vast and monolithic as a hive fleet, the loss was not one of sentiment or morale, but of pure processing power. The emissary had been its cognitive engine of adaptation, the locus of its ability to analyze and overcome a specific high-level threat. Its sudden, violent absence sent a schism of confusion through the fleet's lesser synaptic creatures. For a full cycle, the movements of Echidna became erratic and disordered. Bioships drifted without clear purpose, and vanguard swarms engaged in wasteful, uncoordinated attacks on empty sectors of space. The Kroot, under the newly enlightened guidance of Angkor Prok, took full advantage of this momentary paralysis, launching a series of brutal surgical strikes, crippling nursery ships, and devouring vital reclamation pools of biomass. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed as if the Great Hunt was an undeniable success. But the hive mind is the ultimate survivor. It does not feel loss. It registers a vulnerability and corrects it. Far from the chaotic front lines, deep in the frozen void of the galactic rim, the core consciousness of the larger Leviathan entity, of which Echidna was but a splinter, took notice. The persistent, evolving, and now intellectually guided threat of the Kroot was recategorized. They were no longer classified as mere prey or localized resistance. They were now designated a biophage predator, Class 9, a competitor of the highest order, a creature that not only resisted consumption but actively sought to consume the consumer. This reclassification triggered a directive of absolute priority. The Kroot were no longer a target of opportunity, but the sole and primary focus of Hive Fleet Echidna. The advance on other worlds ceased. The slow, inexorable march of the fleet stopped dead. Then, with the chilling unity of a thinking ocean, the entire Hive Fleet turned. It was no longer drifting, it was hunting. The change in strategy was immediate and terrifying. The first sign was the spawning of a new type of warrior organism, a creature that appeared in the Tyranid swarms with horrifying speed. The Kroot had dubbed them nullhounds. They were sleek quadrupedal hunters, built with the speed of a lictor and the ferocity of a hormigaunt, but their primary weapon was biological, not physical. They exuded a complex pheromonal mist that specifically targeted Kroot physiology. The scent was a genetic key that unlocked and amplified the basest, most feral instincts of the Kroot, while simultaneously severing their connection to their shapers. A Kroot warrior caught in the mist would be overcome by a red-flecked rage, its mind stripped of all discipline and tactical acumen. It would attack anything that moved, friend or foe, until it was cut down. Entire Kroot boarding parties, models of predatory efficiency, were reduced to snarling cannibalistic mobs, tearing each other apart in blood-slicked corridors. The Nullhounds were not designed to kill the Kroot. They were designed to make the Kroot kill themselves. The War in the Void also transformed. Echidna began to produce a new strain of bioship, smaller and faster than the lumbering behemoths the Kroot had previously targeted. These new vessels, designated spore cysts by the Kroot, had a singular, horrific purpose. They did not engage with lance batteries or projectile weapons. Instead, they would accelerate to suicidal velocities, ramming Kroot ships and war spheres. Upon impact, they did not merely explode, they shattered, releasing a cloud of hyper-aggressive, genetically targeted microorganisms. These viral spores bypassed conventional armor and filtration systems, spreading through the Kroot vessel's recycled atmosphere. The effect was not immediate death, but a creeping, agonizing genetic dissolution. Kroot warriors would watch in horror as their limbs began to liquefy, their organs failing as their own DNA was unwritten by the Tyranid plague. The war spheres, once nigh impregnable fortresses, became floating tombs, their inhabitants reduced to puddles of corrupted biological matter. Angkor Prak, his mind a fusion of Kroot cunning and the emissary's cold logic, recognized the new strategy for what it was, a total war of mutual annihilation. The hive mind was no longer trying to simply consume the Kroot for biomass. It was actively studying their unique evolutionary capabilities and designing bespoke counters with chilling precision. The Great Hunt had become a two-way street. The Kroot had wanted to feast on the ultimate predator to force their own evolution. Now the ultimate predator was feasting on their failures to perfect its own. Every Kroot tactic was analyzed, countered, and turned back against them. When Kroot sharpshooters proved effective, the hive mind spawned warrior forms with multi-layered ablative carapaces. When the Kroot used their natural stealth to ambush Tyranid swarms, lictors were evolved with hypersensitive chemoreceptors that could taste a single Kroot skin cell from kilometers away. The psychological toll on the Kroot was immense. Their greatest strength, their adaptability, was being systematically dismantled. The sense of elation that had followed the death of the Norn emissary curdled into a grim, gnawing dread. They were staring into a dark mirror. The Tyranids were showing them the logical endpoint of evolution without spirit, without culture, a purely reactive and consumptive existence. The war was no longer a glorious hunt for apotheosis. It was a desperate struggle to avoid becoming a footnote in the genetic history of a greater monster. The hunters had, with terrifying certainty, become the hunted, and their once proud armada, which had set out to claim its destiny among the stars, was now a cornered animal, fighting for its very survival against a foe that was learning its every secret. The hive mind's counterstroke was more insidious than mere tactical adaptation. It was a war waged on the very essence of what made the Kroot unique, their ability to absorb the genetic traits of their prey. The cornerstone of their existence and the entire purpose of the Great Hunt became their greatest vulnerability. The gamble, so audacious and filled with promise, began to show its terrible, ruinous cost. The first signs were subtle, dismissed as battlefield stress or isolated mutations. A carnivore squad, having recently feasted on a brood of freshly spawned termagants, was observed moving with an unsettling, jerky motion, their heads cocked at an unnatural angle, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. Another kindred, famed for their ambush tactics, began to eschew their rifles altogether, attempting to drown their enemies in sheer numbers, a mindless tidal wave of flesh that was the antithesis of Kroot hunting doctrine. The true horror of their situation became manifest in the belly of the Warsphere carrion nest. A kindred known as the Ebon Talons had achieved a great victory, leading a boarding action against a Tyranid vessel and consuming a brood of Genestealers. They had hoped to absorb the creature's lightning reflexes and formidable strength. For a few cycles, the adaptation seemed a success. The Ebon Talons were faster, stronger, and more lethal in close combat than ever before. But then the changes began to accelerate, spiraling out of control. Their skin paled to a sickly corpse white. A third vestigial arm began to sprout from their chests, twitching with a life of its own. Their beaks grew brittle, falling away to reveal rows of needle-sharp fangs. The most terrifying change was in their minds. The calm, predatory focus of the Kroot was replaced by a chittering, manic energy. They began carving strange, spiral-limbed symbols on the bulkheads of their dens, communicating in a series of clicks and screeches that had nothing to do with the Kroot language. Their shaper, a wise elder named Gunnar, realized the horrifying truth too late. They had not just absorbed the Genestealer's physical traits. They had absorbed the genetic taint of the patriarch, the subtle subliminal link to the hive mind. They were becoming a genestealer cult, but one born of Kroot flesh. The breaking point came when Gunnar attempted to quarantine his kindred. The Ebon Talons, seeing this not as an act of mercy, but as a threat from an outsider, turned on him. They swarmed their own shaper, their new claws and fangs tearing him to pieces in a frenzy of corrupted instinct. With their last link to Kroot society severed, they became a plague within the carrion nest. They moved through the ventilation shafts and service corridors, their numbers swelling as they ambushed and either killed or infected other Kroot. The war sphere, a bustling city of hunters, became a charnel house. The clean, ritualistic cannibalism of the Kroot was replaced by the grotesque fleshy mounds of the genestealer creed. Kroot warriors found themselves fighting not the Tyranid menace without, but a twisted mockery of themselves within. This was not an isolated incident. Across the Kroot fleet, the genetic gamble was failing in 1,000 different ways. Kindreds who had consumed the heavily armored carnifexes found their bodies becoming bloated and slow, their bones thickening until their own weight crushed their internal organs. Others who feasted on the psychic zoanthropes suffered catastrophic mental breakdowns, their minds shattering under the weight of psychic energies their primitive brains were never meant to contain. They became little more than screaming, convulsing beasts, lashing out with uncontrolled blasts of warp energy that tore holes in the fabric of their own ships. The fleet, once a unified force, was now riddled with a cancer of its own making. It was a betrayal not from an external enemy, but from their own flesh. The very path to salvation was proving to be a roadmap to damnation. Angkor Proc, his mind uniquely fortified by the essence of the Norn emissary, was forced to make a series of brutal, agonizing decisions. He had foreseen the risk of flawed adaptation, but not the scale of the corruption. He was no longer just the master of the Great Hunt. He was now its purge master. He created a new cadre of warriors, the Silent Scythes. They were chosen from kindreds who had shown the most genetic stability, Kroot, who had fed sparingly, and under the strictest shaper supervision. Their sacred duty was to board the afflicted ships and cleanse them of the genetically broken. They were witch hunters, inquisitors, and executioners rolled into one. The internal purges were more devastating to the Kroot soul than any battle against the Tyranids. The Silent Scythes would board a war sphere like the carrion nest, and find not a Xenos foe, but creatures that still wore the faces of their cousins and brothers, their bodies twisted into monstrous parodies. They fought Kroot Tyranid hybrids in the corridors of their own homes, the familiar war cries of their people now distorted into alien shrieks. There was no honor in these battles, no worthy biomass to be consumed. It was a grim, sterile butchery, a species amputating its own limbs to stop the spread of gangrene. Entire war spheres, deemed too corrupted to save, were vented to the void, their populations of thousands, loyal and tainted alike, frozen in the silent dark. The Great Hunt, which had begun as a quest for apotheosis, had devolved into a desperate struggle for racial purity, a horrifying echo of the very stagnation they had sought to escape. The Kroot were being bled from within and without, their numbers plummeting, their spirit eroded by the horrifying knowledge that the greatest enemy they faced was, and always had been, themselves. The war for survival became a grim and monstrous equation, a calculus of biomass measured in galactic scales. For every Tyranid bioship the Kroot armada managed to cripple and consume, the Hive Fleet would birth 3 more, each one subtly adapted to counter the tactic that had led to its predecessor's demise. For every Kroot warrior who fell, there was no replacement. The Kroot were a finite species, their numbers vast but not infinite. They had brought their entire civilization to this one point in space and time, and it was being systematically dismantled, ground down by the ceaseless, industrialized hunger of the Great Devourer. The attrition was a slow, cold hemorrhage, draining the lifeblood of a proud and ancient race. The war spheres, once vibrant and teeming with life, began to take on the character of haunted houses. Entire habitation domes were sealed, their life support systems shut down to conserve energy, their corridors silent and dark, save for the mournful sigh of failing machinery. The joyous, raucous feasting rituals that had once defined Kroot culture were replaced by grim, silent affairs, where warriors would consume their rations of nutrient paste with a joyless efficiency. There was no glory in this meal, no communion with the fallen. It was merely fuel to continue the hopeless fight. The air in every Kroot vessel grew thin and stale, heavy with the stench of fear, recycled oxygen, and the ever-present faint aroma of Tyranid ichor, that seemed to cling to everything. The logistical nightmare was as great a threat as the Hive Fleet itself. The Kroot Armada was a nomadic nation that had cut itself off from all sources of supply. Their rifles needed ammunition, their ships required fuel and repair, and their bodies demanded sustenance. The captured tow weaponry they had relied upon began to fail. Power cells drained and could not be recharged. Focusing crystals cracked from overuse. The Kroot, masters of primitive weaponry but novices with advanced technology, could not replicate the complex components. Rifles became clubs, and pulse carbines were stripped for scrap metal to patch hull breaches. They were regressing, the technological boons of their tow partnership peeling away to reveal the savage tribal core beneath. This decay was happening just as a new, unexpected player entered the horrifying theater of war. Far from the front lines of the Kroot Tyranid conflict, Commander Oshacera, now granted the honorific of Shazo for her grim victory on Taros, had assembled her punitive fleet. It was not the largest fleet in the tow navy, but it was the fastest and most advanced. Its heart was composed of the new Ilkislip class, Messenger of Doom, starships, sleek predatory vessels designed for rapid response and overwhelming firepower. Oshacera herself commanded from the bridge of the Vashaun El Kajanan, the patient blade of vengeance, her XD-22 battlesuit integrated directly into the ship's command throne, making the vessel an extension of her own peerless tactical will. Her mission, issued by the Ethereal Council, was clear: intercept the Kroot, force their submission, and make them answer for their great betrayal. The tow fleet translated from AL Cube transit into the Stygian Nebula like a scalpel entering a wound. Their initial sensor sweeps presented a picture of such utter chaos that the shipboard tactical AIs struggled to process it. They had expected to find the Kroot Armada. Instead, they found a war that defied all known strategic paradigms. The space was a churning vortex of bioships and Kroot vessels, a chaotic melee with no discernible front line. They saw a Kroot war sphere, its hull breached and venting atmosphere, being swarmed by thousands of winged Tyranid creatures, even as the Kroot on its surface fought a desperate rearguard action. They witnessed a squadron of tow-built Kroot freighters, their engines glowing cherry red, making a suicide run on a Tyranid hive ship, detonating in a silent flash of plasma that barely scarred the larger creature's hide. The scale of the violence, the sheer desperation of it, was beyond anything Oshacera's carefully ordered mind could have conceived. Her orders were to engage the Kroot. Following the cold logic of her office, she gave the command. The patient blade of vengeance and its escorts closed on a group of Kroot ships that were attempting to disengage from a losing fight with a Tyranid cruiser. "Open a hailing frequency," Oshacera commanded. "Broadcast on all Kroot channels. This is Shas Oshacera of the Tow Empire. By the will of the Ethereal Council, you are ordered to stand down your vessels and surrender. Explain your treason." The only reply was a burst of ragged, inaccurate fire from the lead Kroot ship's dorsal cannons. The shot went wide, a gesture of pure, thoughtless defiance. Oshacera felt a pang of something cold and hard in her chest. Not anger. Not yet. It was a sense of profound disappointment. She had fought alongside these creatures. She had relied on their strength, respected their savage honor. To see them reduced to this, a disorganized, desperate rabble, lashing out blindly, was a tragedy. But her duty was clear. "Target their engines," she ordered, her voice flat. "Disable. Do not destroy." The tow fleet's railguns spoke, firing lances of incandescent energy across the void. The shots were surgically precise. The engines of the Kroot ships exploded in silent blue-white blossoms of energy, leaving them dead and adrift in space. The intervention of the tow turned the chaotic battlefield into a three-sided slaughterhouse. The Tyranids, lacking any concept of diplomacy or allegiance, saw the new arrivals as nothing more than a fresh source of biomass. A wave of vanguard organisms immediately broke off from their assault on the Kroot and surged towards Oshacera's fleet. The Kroot, trapped between their relentless biological foe and the cold, unforgiving judgment of their former allies, were caught in a perfect vice. Some Kroot ships, in a final act of nihilistic despair, opened fire on both tow and Tyranid alike, their guns blazing until they were overwhelmed and destroyed. The war had reached a new level of complexity and horror. It was no longer a simple hunt or a war of two sides. It was a vortex of annihilation, a place where alliances were meaningless and the only currency was survival, a currency the Kroot were rapidly running out of. The arrival of the Tow fleet was the final catalyst that pushed Angkor Prok's grand strategy from desperation into the realm of the truly apocalyptic. The Kroot were now caught in an unwinnable war of three fronts. Before them lay the endless, evolving tide of Hive Fleet Echidna. Behind them, the cold, precise retribution of the Tow Empire. And within them, the creeping cancer of genetic corruption. Every logical course of action, retreat, surrender, a war of attrition, led to the same inevitable conclusion, the extinction of his species. The Shaper King, his mind a unique fusion of predatory instinct and the cold calculus of the Norn emissary, saw only one path remaining. It was a path so fraught with peril, so utterly contrary to the instinct for survival, that no sane commander would ever conceive of it. It was a final desperate gambit, a suicide mission on a species-wide scale. His new command echoed through the shattered remnant of the Kroot armada, a silent psychic decree that bypassed comms and was felt in the marrow of every Kroot's bones. They would cease all defensive actions. They would abandon the strategy of crippling and consuming the Hive fleet piece by piece. They would gather the core of their remaining fleet, every functional war sphere and every warrior still deemed genetically pure, and they would drive it like a spear into the very heart of Hive Fleet Echidna. Their target was not a mere hive ship or a synaptic command beast. Their target was the fleet's ultimate genesis organism, the colossal planetoid-sized creature that served as the fleet's womb, the living biofactory from which the Norn queens themselves were spawned. They would not slay the beast from without. They would allow it to consume them, and from within its belly, they would devour its soul. The plan was a form of collective ritual suicide. The majority of the Kroot armada, the damaged ships, the less experienced kindreds, and those showing the first subtle signs of genetic taint were tasked with forming a rearguard. Their orders were not to survive, but to die with purpose. They were to hurl themselves at the encroaching Tow and Tyranid fleets, creating a screen of chaos and wreckage that would buy Angkor Prok's chosen fleet the time it needed to make its final desperate run. It was a command for thousands to die so that a handful might reach the heart of the beast. To the horror of the observing Tow, the order was obeyed without question. Damaged Kroot vessels, many barely holding together, turned and accelerated towards Oshacera's fleet, their weapons firing wildly. War spheres, their internal populations already decimated, positioned themselves between the Tow and Prok's assault group, absorbing devastating railgun volleys until their ancient hulls cracked and imploded. It was a self-immolation of a people, a display of fanaticism that chilled even the most hardened Firecast veterans. While the rearguard bought them time with their lives, Angkor Prok led the core of his evolved fleet on a direct course for the center of the Hive fleet. This was no stealthy infiltration. It was a battering ram of flesh and ancient technology. The lead vessel was the root of ages itself, its prow reinforced with the fossilized hides of 100 different apex predators from 100 different worlds. Prok stood on the open command bridge, the vacuum of space held at bay by a shimmering energy field, the winds of the stellar void whipping at his silver quills. He and his chosen warriors, the Silent Scythes and the Kindreds, who had most successfully integrated Tyranid traits, had prepared themselves for this final act. They had starved themselves for days, honing their hunger to a razor's edge. They had painted their bodies with the bioluminescent ichor of fallen Tyranid beasts, a ritual anointing for this last supper. Their path was a channel of pure destruction. Tyranid bioships, alerted to the spirit thrust, moved to intercept. The Kroot met them, not with tactics, but with momentum and nihilistic fury. Smaller Kroot ships latched onto the larger Tyranid vessels like parasites, their occupants blowing the charges on their own reactors to cripple the enemy. The root of ages plowed through the defensive screen, its immense mass and ancient power shrugging off the impact of lesser creatures. Its hull was breached in 100 places, Tyranid organisms pouring into its corridors, but the Kroot warriors within did not try to repel them. They met them in the passageways, and the entire war sphere became a single rolling melee, a microcosm of the greater war outside. Finally, they saw it. Looming out of the dark void, blotting out the stars, was the spawning beast. It was a creature of impossible scale, not so much a ship as a living world. Its surface was a continent of pulsating flesh, dotted with mountain-sized spawning sacs and river-like arteries pumping oceans of amniotic fluid. Its psychic presence was overwhelming, a silent, deafening chorus of birth and hunger. It was the mother source, the alpha and omega of Hive Fleet Echidna. As the root of ages, now little more than a battered, burning hulk, made its final approach, a vast sphincter-like orifice opened on the spawning beast's surface, a maw designed to draw in and consume entire worlds. It was an invitation to oblivion. Angkor Proc gave his final command. For the future of the kindreds, his voice echoed in their minds. Let the final feast begin. With its last reserves of power, the root of ages plunged into the gaping maw. The darkness closed around them, and the ancient war sphere was engulfed, drawn into the digestive tracts of the colossal creature. The sounds of battle were replaced by the sickening, wet sounds of organic machinery. The Kroot assault force had breached the gates of hell, willingly. They were now inside the enemy, a poison pill in the belly of the god monster, ready to enact a final, terrible act of consumption that would either grant their species its apotheosis or erase it from existence forever. The space where Angkor Proc's spearhead had vanished into the maw of the spawning beast became the vortex of the entire war. The Tyranid fleet, its central organism having swallowed the Kroot leader, began to pull back into a defensive sphere around its mother womb, a protective instinct overriding its aggressive expansion. This consolidation of forces presented Oshacera with a tactical nightmare. Her punitive fleet was now caught between the frenzied, suicidal charges of the Kroot rearguard and the tightening defensive formation of the main Tyranid fleet. Every precept of Tonaval doctrine screamed for a withdrawal to a more defensible position, but the mystery of the Kroot's final act held her fast. What was this insane gambit? What could they possibly hope to achieve inside the belly of that titan? Her duty to the ethereals demanded she reclaim the Kroot, but her instinct as a commander told her she was witnessing the climax of a drama far older and more profound than the politics of the greater good. She made a commander's choice, a decision that would define her legend. She would not retreat. She would press the attack. All units, she broadcast, her voice cutting through the chaotic battle chatter with absolute clarity. Focus fire on the primary Tyranid bioform. Breach its outer defenses. I want to know what Proc is doing. It was a bold, almost reckless command. The patient blade of vengeance surged forward, its attendant cruisers forming a perfect arrowhead formation behind it. Their railguns began a steady, rhythmic barrage, sending lances of pure energy hammering against the pulsating hide of the spawning beast. They were joined by the desperate, dying fire of the Kroot rearguard, who, seeing their Shaper King's final destination now under assault by their former allies, seemed to find a new, insane purpose. Kroot and Tau, enemies moments before, were now firing on the same target, a momentary, unspoken alliance born of mutual desperation against a greater horror. The surface of the spawning beast erupted in a series of spectacular, silent explosions. Chunks of chitin the size of moons were blasted into the void. From these wounds poured not blood, but a torrent of new Tyranid organisms, a final, desperate immune response. The void between the Tau fleet and the spawning beast became a solid wall of bodies and claws, a meat grinder of a battle at point-blank range. Drones and battlesuits launched from Oshacera's ships, their pulse fire stitching patterns of light through the swarm. It was here, in this maelstrom of apocalyptic chaos, that the two commanders would finally meet. Inside the spawning beast, the root of ages was being torn apart by powerful digestive enzymes and crushing muscular contractions. But its sacrifice had served its purpose. It had carried Angkor Proc and his elite honor guard of 500 silent scythes deep into the creature's innards. They now stood in a cavernous chamber of living flesh, the air thick with corrosive fog, the ground beneath their feet a quivering membrane. They were at the heart of the beast, near its primary neural core. But they were not alone. Waiting for them, as if it had been standing in silent vigil for this exact moment, was the Hive Tyrant Prime. This was not just another Tyranid creature. It was the ultimate guardian, the final and most perfect warrior form Echidna could produce. It was a giant, its body a seamless fusion of bone-white armor and crimson muscle. In one set of arms it held a massive warp blast cannon, and in the other a pair of glittering monomolecular bone swords, each the size of a Kroot warrior. Its head was a crested nightmare, but its four eyes burned with a cold, malevolent intelligence that spoke not of instinct, but of direct, undiluted connection to the hive mind itself. There were no words, no challenges. The battle began with a psychic roar from the Hive Tyrant that sent a wave of nauseating terror through the Kroot. Angkor Proc, his own mind a fortress, stood firm, and his resilience gave strength to his warriors. The silent scythes charged, their movements a blur of evolved speed. They were the pinnacle of the Kroot species, warriors who had feasted on the finest genetic material of 1,000 battles. They met the Hive Tyrant's charge in a clash of biological titans. The chamber echoed with the shriek of claws on living armor and the wet, tearing sound of flesh being rent. But the Hive Tyrant was a demigod of war. For every Kroot that managed to score a shallow cut on its hide, the tyrant would scythe another in two with a casual flick of its blades. Its cannon fired, not in wild bursts, but in calculated shots that vaporized Kroot warriors a half-second before they could land a killing blow. Angkor Proc did not immediately join the melee. He stood back, his ancient eyes watching, analyzing, his mind processing the battle with the speed of a machine. He was not watching a fight. He was reading a living text, discerning the Hive Tyrant's patterns, its rhythms, the subtle shift of its weight before it struck. He saw that its power was absolute, its defense impenetrable. It could not be defeated by force. It had to be undone. He finally moved, not towards the tyrant, but towards the far wall of the chamber, where a series of thick, cable-like nerve bundles snaked their way towards the ceiling. These were the conduits that fed the tyrant its direct link to the hive mind. As his warriors died around him, buying him precious seconds with their lives, Proc began to tear at the nerve bundles with his bare hands and beak. It was an act of supreme heresy, of deicide. The spawning beast shuddered in agony, and for a split second, the Hive Tyrant's flawless movements faltered. Its connection to the infinite calculus of the hive mind was severed. It was now, for the first time in its existence, alone. It was still a peerless killing machine, but it was now fighting on instinct, not on omniscience. It was this, the briefest flicker of confusion in its eyes, that Proc had been waiting for. He let out a piercing cry, a true Kroot hunting call, and charged. The Hive Tyrant, enraged and disoriented, turned to meet him. The final duel began, Shaper King against Living Weapon, a battle for the future of an evolution, fought in the dying heart of a god. The duel between Angkor Proc and the now isolated Hive Tyrant was a savage spectacle. The Hive Tyrant, robbed of the hive mind's precognitive guidance, fought with the brute's fury, its bone swords carving great chunks from the fleshy walls of the chamber as Proc evaded its clumsy, enraged lunges. The Shaper King, in contrast, was a phantom of predatory grace. He flowed around the monstrous creature, his movements economical and precise, his ancient staff a blur that deflected and redirected the tyrant's attacks. He was not trying to kill it, not yet. He was driving it, herding it like a stubborn grox, forcing it back step by step towards the chamber's epicenter, where the primary neural nexus of the spawning beast pulsed with a sickly, ethereal light. It was a globe of raw synaptic energy the size of a Krootox, the very soul of the creature made manifest. The last of the silent scythes sacrificed themselves in a final, glorious charge, buying their master the last few seconds he needed. As the Hive Tyrant disemboweled the final Kroot warrior, its back was, for a single, fatal instant, turned to the Nexus. With a final guttural cry that was a prayer to his savage gods, Angkor Proc lunged. He did not strike the tyrant. He vaulted onto its armored back, scrambled up its neck crest, and with a tremendous leap, threw himself directly into the synaptic globe. The moment he made contact, reality dissolved. The physical world of the chamber vanished, replaced by an infinite, silent ocean of pure consciousness. He was adrift in the very essence of Hive Fleet Echidna, a mind without a body, a will without a form. He felt the collective memories of a billion consumed lives, the cold, dispassionate blueprints for 1,000,000 different bio-horrors. It was a torrent of information and sensation that should have annihilated his sanity, dissolving his individuality into the greater whole. But Angkor Proc's mind was no longer purely Kroot. It was now a hybrid, fortified by the will of the Norn emissary he had consumed. He held on to the core of his being, the singular predatory focus of the Kroot, and used it as an anchor in the psychic hurricane. And then he began to do what his species did best. He began to feast. He did not eat with his beak, but with his soul. his consciousness tearing off and absorbing great swaths of the hive mind's essence. He consumed its knowledge of genetics, its understanding of biomass conversion, its cold and perfect logic of war. This ultimate act of consumption sent a death shock through the entire Tyranid fleet. On the outside, Oshacera watched in stunned disbelief as the colossal spawning beast began to convulse. Its movements became spastic and uncontrolled. Vast cyst-like growths on its surface ruptured, spewing half-formed creatures and corrosive amniotic fluid into the void. The hive tyrant, its anchor to reality gone, let out a silent, soul-shattering scream and simply collapsed, its immense body falling inert to the floor of the chamber. The psychic symphony of the hive mind, the constant, oppressive mental static that had blanketed the system, winked out of existence, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. The individual Tyranid bioships, their synaptic links severed, went feral. They began to attack one another, reverting to the most basic predatory instincts of the creatures they were made from. Hive Fleet Echidna was no more. It had been decapitated, its mind devoured from within. From the shuddering corpse of the spawning beast, a single tremendous pulse of psychic energy erupted, washing over the entire system. It was not the chaotic scream of the Tyranids, but something new, something cold, structured, and utterly alien. Every surviving Kroot in the system, from the warriors on the rearguard ships to the wounded and dying, felt it touch their minds. It was a wave of pure information, of genetic imperative. It was the final, distilled product of Anchroprox apotheosis. It was a blueprint for a new existence. Their flesh began to crawl, their bones to shift, their minds to rewire. The Great Hunt's ultimate goal had been achieved. The Kroot had broken the chains of their stagnation. They had evolved, but the victory was a Pyrrhic one, a triumph so absolute it was indistinguishable from a curse. The Kroot were no longer the vibrant, savage, but ultimately understandable creatures the galaxy had known. The essence they had absorbed was too pure, too alien. Their individuality, the fierce pride of the kindreds that had been their defining cultural trait, was submerged. Their minds, once separate but linked by culture, were now intertwined in a silent collective chorus, a network of consciousness that mimicked the hive mind they had destroyed. They were a single entity in a multitude of bodies. Their forms became sleeker, harder, their hides taking on the bone-white and purple markings of echidna. Their eyes, once black and bird-like, now glowed with the cold, intelligent light of a predator that sees the universe not as a place to live, but as a larder to be consumed. They had set out to steal the fire of the gods, and in doing so, they had become the fire themselves. The Kroot were dead. From the ashes of their victory, something far more terrifying had been born. The immediate aftermath of Anchroprox apotheosis was a scene of chilling, silent order emerging from absolute chaos. The remaining Kroot vessels, which seconds before had been fighting a suicidal battle of annihilation, ceased all aggressive action. Their movements, once erratic and desperate, became fluid and coordinated. Without a single word of communication being detected by the tow fleet, the Kroot ships began to disengage from their battles, forming up into perfect geometric formations. They moved with the eerie precision of a machine, a stark and terrifying contrast to the passionate savagery they had displayed moments earlier. They were no longer an army of individuals. They were the limbs of a single thinking creature. On the bridge of the patient blade of vengeance, Oshacera watched the unfolding scene, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Her tactical displays, which had been a chaotic storm of red and blue icons, now showed a new and disturbing pattern. The Tyranid icons were still red, but they were now attacking each other in a frenzy of self-destruction. The blue icons of the Kroot, however, had turned a cold, stark white on her display, a color the system AI reserved for unclassified high-level strategic threats. "What is happening?" she demanded of her communications officer. "Have they surrendered? Are they responding to our hails?" The officer, a young, capable Shasui, shook her head, her antennae twitching with anxiety. "Negative, Shazo. There is no communication, no surrender signals. They are simply acting as one." Oshacera zoomed her main view screen in on the nearest Kroot vessel, a heavily damaged cruiser that had lost its primary engines. She watched as a smaller, more intact Kroot ship approached it. There was no docking procedure, no rescue attempt. Instead, the crew of the intact ship, their forms subtly altered, sleeker and paler than before, swarmed onto the crippled vessel. They were not carrying medical supplies or repair kits. They were carrying flensing tools and consumption implements. With a horrifying, dispassionate efficiency, they began to butcher the wounded and dying of their own kind, rendering their bodies down into biomass with the cold methodology of an abattoir. The strong were consuming the weak, not in a ritual of honor, but as a simple act of resource reclamation. This was not Kroot behavior. This was Tyranid behavior. A horrifying realization dawned on Oshacera. The Kroot hadn't just defeated the Hive Fleet, they had replaced it. They had absorbed its most terrifying qualities, its unity of purpose, its cold calculus of biomass, its utter lack of sentiment or individuality. They had traded their soul for their survival. "All ships, she commanded, her voice strained, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Withdraw, full astern. Maintain a sensor lock, but do not, I repeat, do not engage." The order was met with a moment of stunned silence from her bridge. "Crew, withdraw," when their primary target was disabled and in disarray. But they saw the look on their commander's face, a look of profound horror that transcended tactical considerations, and they obeyed. The tow fleet, its mission of punitive action now rendered terrifyingly moot, began a slow, cautious retreat from the field of battle. They bore witness to the birth of a new power. The newly transformed Kroot ignored the retreating tow completely, viewing them as irrelevant, a non-threat not currently worthy of their attention. Their entire focus was on the remnants of Hive Fleet Echidna. A vast coordinated feeding frenzy began. The Kroot ships, acting as cosmic vultures, descended upon the drifting, feral Tyranid bioships. Boarding parties of the new, silent Kroot warriors swarmed over the living hulks, slaughtering the directionless creatures within and beginning the process of consumption and adaptation on an industrial scale. The corpse of the spawning beast became the center of this new dominion, a grotesque larder from which the transformed Kroot drew forth the purest genetic material. The front line of the war had not been broken. It had been absorbed. The chaotic battlefield was being tidied, sanitized by this new, terrifyingly efficient entity. Wreckage was broken down for raw materials. Bodies, both Kroot and Tyranid, were rendered into nutrient slurry. The shattered veil between hunter and prey was gone, leaving only the consumer. Oshacera, watching the last images from her long-range sensor drones before they too were consumed, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold of the void. She had come here to punish a rogue auxiliary force. She was leaving with a report for the Ethereal Council that would shake the Tow Empire to its very foundations. The Kroot were no longer their allies. They were not even their enemies. They had become a force of nature, a thinking plague. She had not witnessed the end of a rebellion, but the birth of a monster. The Tow had lost an army, but the galaxy, she suspected, had just gained a new and terrible predator. The Tow Empire, an edifice built on the unshakable pillars of logic, unity, and the certainty of the greater good, was not equipped to process the news Oshacera brought back from the Halor Tract. Her report, delivered via secure astropathic relay long before her fleet returned, was met first with disbelief, then with analytical denial, and finally with a quiet, creeping terror that permeated the highest circles of power on Tone. The Ethereal Council convened in a closed session that lasted for 3 full rotations. The serene halls were once charged with an atmosphere of profound crisis. The data was irrefutable: sensor logs, bioscans, and Oshacera's own chilling testimony. The Kroot, their most numerous and vital auxiliary, had not merely seceded. They had undergone a species-level metamorphosis into something unrecognizable, something that mirrored their most feared galactic enemy. Whispers began to circulate, spreading from the shielded chambers of the ethereals to the command centers of the Firecast and the economic forums of the Watercast. The Great Hunt was no longer a matter of a broken treaty. It was an existential threat. The Tau had always viewed the galaxy through a lens of potential. Every race was a candidate for inclusion in the greater good, a piece of a puzzle waiting to be solved. But this new entity, this thinking predator that wore the flesh of their former allies, did not fit into their paradigm. How do you reason with a hunger that has consumed reason itself? How do you bring a plague into the fold of the greater good? The new Kroot, for their part, did not act like a conventional conqueror. They did not immediately strike at the Tow Empire or broadcast declarations of a new dominion. Their first movements were slow, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. Under the silent, unified command of the consciousness that had once been Ankra Proc, the newly christened Krotok fleet began to move. They did not scatter to their former homes or mercenary posts. They moved as one, a single, cohesive entity, a nomadic nation fleet whose only territory was its own armada. Their first destination was a series of uninhabited but life-bearing worlds in a neighboring star system, worlds that had been designated by the Earth, cast for future colonization. When Tau scout drones arrived to observe their actions, they recorded scenes of methodical biological deconstruction. The Kroot did not build cities or establish outposts. They landed vast, newly adapted bioships, grown from the corpse of the spawning beast, that acted as planetary-scale processing engines. Swarms of the silent, transformed Kroot warriors descended to the surface and began to harvest every single scrap of living material. They did not differentiate between flora and fauna, between simple microbes and complex animals. It was all simply biomass. Entire forests were uprooted and fed into the maws of the processing ships. Oceans were drained and filtered. For their organic content, the worlds were not conquered. They were consumed, stripped bare until they were nothing more than sterile balls of rock and dust. The purpose of this horrifying harvest became clear when the scout drones observed new spawning pools being formed within the Kroot fleet. They were using the acquired biomass to fuel a massive population explosion. But they were not breeding the old Kroot. They were gestating new forms, iterating on their newly acquired genetic base. Some were hulking brutes with carapaces as thick as a battle tank's armor. Others were lithe winged hunters capable of atmospheric and void flight. They were engaging in a process of guided, hyper-accelerated evolution, using the raw material of entire worlds to perfect their new nature. They were building an army, not for a specific war, but for the principle of war itself. They were becoming the perfect predator. These actions sent a new wave of panic through the Tau Empire. This was a direct threat to their expansionist philosophy. The Kroot were not just a potential enemy, they were a direct competitor, consuming the very worlds the Tau needed to fuel their own growth. Whispers of a new war began to circulate in earnest, no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. Firecast commanders began drawing up contingency plans, wargaming scenarios against a foe that thought like a Tyranid, but retained the cunning and ambush tactics of the Kroot. The results of these simulations were universally grim. The Kroot were a perfect synthesis of swarm tactics and individual predatory skill, a combination that no Tau doctrine was designed to counter. The most chilling whisper came from a watercast diplomat who had spent her life studying the Kroot. She posited a terrifying theory. The Great Hunt, she argued, may not have been an isolated event. What if it was merely the first? What if this transformation was not the end of their evolution, but the beginning? The Kroot had always been a stagnant species seeking a way forward. Now they had found it. Their new purpose, their new culture, might be an endless cycle of great hunts. They would consume a worthy foe, absorb its strengths, and then move on to the next, growing ever stronger, ever more perfect. The war against Hive Fleet Echidna was not the end. It was merely the crucible that had forged them into a weapon that would now, inevitably, need to be tested against a new and worthy prey. And as the diplomat looked at a star chart of the local quadrant, she noted with a shudder that the Tau Empire, with its advanced technology, diverse population, and rich worlds, was the most potent, most challenging, and most tempting target in the entire region. The victory of the Great Hunt had not ended a war. It had merely set the stage for a new one, a war for survival against the monstrous children of their own making. The first act of the newly christened Kroot hegemony was not one of conquest but of purification. Once their numbers had been sufficiently bolstered by the consumption of the barren worlds, the entire armada, now sleeker, larger, and more terrifyingly uniform than ever before, altered its course. A single vector was plotted, a direct line that cut across established Tau trade routes and ignored imperial patrol zones. Their destination was a place of deep, almost sacred significance, a name that echoed in the genetic memory of every creature in the fleet: Pesh, the homeworld, the cradle of their species. The news of the Armada's return sent a ripple of confusion and hope through the scattered Kroot enclaves that had not joined the Great Hunt. On Pesh itself, a world of dense, primeval jungles and towering tree cities, the remaining kindreds had fallen into disarray. They had felt the psychic call of Angkor Prak, but their shapers, either too conservative, too fearful, or too loyal to their Tau contracts, had refused it. They had been left behind, adrift in a galaxy that now viewed their entire species with suspicion and hatred. The return of the Great Hunt fleet was seen by many as a homecoming, the triumphant return of their saviors. They prepared great feasts, ready to welcome their evolved brethren and share in the genetic bounty they had won. They believed they were about to be rewarded for their patience. They were catastrophically wrong. The Kroot fleet did not enter orbit with ceremony. It did not deploy shuttles or send ambassadors. It established a blockade, a perfect sphere of warships that sealed the planet from the rest of the galaxy. Then the cleansing began. From the bellies of the great bioships, a rain of fleshy pods descended through the atmosphere. But these were not landing craft carrying warriors. They were spore mines, Tyranid technology repurposed and perfected. Upon impact with the dense jungle canopy, they exploded, releasing clouds of the same hyper-aggressive, gene-scouring virus that had been used against the war spheres. The verdant, life-choked jungles of Pish began to die. The ancient trees, some of which had stood since before the Toe, had learned to walk, withered, and turned to gray dust. The vibrant ecosystem of predators and prey that had shaped the Kroot for millennia was wiped out in a matter of hours, a silent biological holocaust. The Kroot on the surface were thrown into absolute panic. Their skin began to crawl, their bodies rebelling against them as the virus sought to unwrite their stagnant DNA. But for them, the hegemony had reserved a more personal and far more horrific fate. The transformed Kroot warriors descended en masse. They were ghosts returning to their ancestral home. But they felt no nostalgia, no connection to the sacred hunting grounds of their past. They moved through the dying forests with a cold, relentless purpose. Their target was their own unevolved kin. The battles, if they could be called that, were a brutal, one-sided slaughter. The Petch Kroot, fierce warriors by any normal standard, were hopelessly outmatched. They were fighting their own future, a version of themselves that was stronger, faster, and utterly unified in thought and action. The Kroot did not need to speak or signal. They moved with the flawless coordination of a shoal of fish, flanking and encircling the disorganized defenders with contemptuous ease. The familiar click of the Kroot rifle was answered by the shriek of bioweaponry that fired living, flesh-boring maggots, or by the silent strike of a hardened chitinous talon. This was not a war of conquest. It was a eugenic purge on a planetary scale. The Kroot were not trying to subjugate their former brethren. They were erasing a genetic stain. In the new, cold logic of the hegemony, the Kroot who had refused the call were an evolutionary dead end, a failed draft of the species that had to be eliminated to ensure the purity of the new bloodline. Every kill was followed by the ritual of consumption, but it was a grim, joyless act. The flesh of their cousins was not consumed for strength or knowledge, for it held neither. It was simply reabsorbed as raw biomass, a final insulting act of reductionism that stripped the fallen of all honor and identity. Shapers were dragged from their sacred dens and devoured by creatures who were their perfect, merciless heirs. The great family trees, carved into the heartwood of the tallest trees, were set alight, their histories of honor and lineage turned to smoke and ash. The final stand took place at the foot of the monolithic Grey Peak, the most sacred site on Pech, where the first Shaper was said to have communed with the planet's spirit. A coalition of the last surviving kindreds, led by an ancient Shaper who had been Angkor Prok's staunchest rival, made their final defense. They fought with the courage of the damned, but they were swept away like dust before a hurricane. The rival Shaper was cornered by a towering Kroot warrior, a creature that bore the unmistakable bone-white crest of a Hive tyrant, yet moved with the grace of a Kroot hunter. There was no duel. The creature that was the hegemony's avatar simply impaled the old Shaper, lifted his broken body, and consumed his head in a single bite. With that act, the last vestige of the old Kroot was extinguished. The cleansing of Pech was complete. The Kroot had severed their final tie to their past, a final horrific declaration that the old way was not just obsolete, but an abomination. They had scoured their own cradle, leaving behind a barren, silent world as the ultimate monument to their terrible rebirth. The scouring of Pech was the hegemony's foundational act, a brutal declaration of its new identity. The legacy of the Great Hunt was not one of glory, but of a horrifying, all-consuming hunger for perfection. Hive Fleet Echidna had been defeated, but its spirit had proven victorious, having successfully implanted its core tenets of consumption, adaptation, and merciless genetic purity into a new and far more dangerous host. The Kroot, a species once defined by their fierce individuality and mercenary honor, were now a relic, a footnote in the history of their monstrous successors. The Krotok had been born, and the galaxy, already drowning in its own wars and sorrows, had gained a new and uniquely terrifying predator. The balance of power in the eastern fringe was irrevocably shattered. The Tau Empire found itself in the most precarious position in its history. It had lost its most crucial military auxiliary, and in its place gained a mortal enemy that knew every one of its weaknesses. The Krotok were a dark mirror to the Tau, an empire of biological manifest destiny to counter their own creed of technological and social expansion. The borders between the two powers became a festering wound, a series of fortified worlds and listening posts where the Firecast stood in grim vigil, waiting for the inevitable invasion. The optimism of the Fifth Sphere expansion withered and died, replaced by a defensive, fearful crouch. The greater good had encountered a force that it could not assimilate, could not reason with, and perhaps could not even defeat. The legend of Oshacera was cemented not as a victorious commander, but as the Cassandra of the modern Tau, the one who had witnessed the birth of the monster on their doorstep, and whose warnings now echoed in every strategic decision the Ethereals made. For the wider galaxy, the change was more subtle, but no less profound. Imperial analysts of the Ordo Xenos, piecing together fragmented astropathic reports from the Damocles Gulf and beyond, were forced to create a new classification of Xenos threat. The Krotok were not a mindless swarm like the Tyranids, nor were they a conventional empire like the Tau. They were a predatory hegemony, a nomadic spacefaring civilization whose sole purpose was self-perfection through the consumption of other life forms. They were a thinking plague, a cancer that learned. The few imperial worlds that bordered Krotok hunting grounds learned this lesson in the most brutal fashion. Planets were not invaded for territory or resources, but were instead evaluated for their genetic value. If a world's biosphere was deemed worthy, the Krotok would descend and harvest it with terrifying efficiency, their new bioforms perfectly adapted to overcome the local Imperial Guard garrisons. If a world was deemed stagnant, it was simply ignored, left to its own ignorant fate, an insult more profound than any invasion. The legacy of Angkor Proc became a damned and terrible legend. He was the savior who had destroyed his people to save them, the Moses who had led his followers to the promised land and transformed them into the locusts that would devour it. The entity that now resided at the heart of the Krotok consciousness, the silent thinking core that had once been the Shaper King, was the architect of this new age of hunger. It did not rule with decrees or commands, but with pure biological imperative. It guided the hegemony's evolution, selecting new targets for consumption, designing new warrior forms, and pursuing a relentless, inscrutable goal of ultimate adaptation. The Great Hunt had never ended. It had simply become the permanent state of being for the entire race. In the end, the Kroot had broken their stagnation. They had achieved the evolution they so desperately craved. But in doing so, they had sacrificed everything that made them Kroot. They had traded their culture for efficiency, their spirit for unity, and their soul for a cold and unending hunger. The ash of their former selves was the foundation of a new and terrible dominion. The galaxy was now a hunting ground, and its myriad species were merely potential meals, stepping stones on the Krotok's endless bloody path to evolutionary godhood. The flickering candle of hope in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium had not been bolstered. A new and impossibly cold wind had just begun to blow, threatening to extinguish it forever.